We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
Welcome to Football is Family, a podcast dedicated to the fan and fan experience. My name is Jeremy McFarlin, and I want to look at the positive behind what makes football so enjoyable to watch and follow. I want to know why you are a fan of your team, of a player, or an era of football. Whether the pros, college, or high school, I want to hear and share your stories and your love for the game. If you want to be part of this podcast, please message me on Twitter at Jeremy_McFarlin or on Facebook at the Football is Family Facebook page. I'd like to welcome everybody back to Football is Family, and I apologize for how I sound. Tennessee in May doesn't work well with sinuses and the pollen and everything like that. So I'm going to let my guests do the majority of the talking today. I got a special guest, a newcomer to the Sports History Network. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I am Greg James, and I am the co-host of the podcast entitled From the 55-Yard Line, which is hosted not only on the Sports History Network, but on my own radio show, CFL America Radio.
The 55-yard line. Now, that obviously is not a reference to American football. What is it a reference
not at all.
to?
That is in reference to Canadian football.
Now, you're going to have to talk slow to me. I'm Tennessean, number one, that is used to Southeastern Conference football. Why is there 55 yards in Canadian football?
Well, the Canadian football field is longer and wider. So instead of a 100-yard field in Canadian and American football, you have a 110-yard field in Canadian football.
Now, I saw something today that said it was something to do with the metric system.
No, not at all. Not at all. The field came into being about 100 years ago. So the metric system did not play a part. It's a different brand of football in Canada.
It's a different brand now. And I saw that on the internet, and I thought everything on the internet was right. What is different about Canadian football, just the basics, and American football?
Well, in Canadian football, it is 3 downs versus 4 downs. It is 12 men on the field. It's unlimited motion in the backfield. And in Canadian football, there is a thing we call the rouge, which basically is an unreturned punt and or missed field goal.
Now, is it true that if you miss a field goal, but it goes out of bounds on that side, it's a point? It goes out the end zone. Right. Now, see, that's what I'm talking about. I could be a kicker because I'm going to miss them all.
Well, the great thing about the rouge is it gives the punter, the punter takes on a little bit more importance other than just kicking for field position. It's also kicking for possible points.
Oh, so it applies to the punter too. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So if you're punting and the punt return team does not return that punt or do anything with that punt, well, that's a point for the team that's punting.
So there's a lot of differences. How many teams are in the Canadian Football League?
Right now, the Canadian League is 9 teams.
9 teams. Now, how does that work?
There's 4 in the East and 5 in the West.
There's a lot of geography up in Canada, and that's part of the reason why there's differences of the East and the West.
Right.
Okay. What got you into Canadian football?
Well, I've said on other podcasts, the thing that got me into Canadian football was going back to when I was a kid in the 70s, was the library. I would sit around, wait for my mom to pick us up after school. Well, when you're sitting in the library, I always kind of gravitated towards the sports section of books and the encyclopedias and learned about Canadian football, and just always the concept of Canadian football always intrigued me. But back then, there was no way to watch Canadian football. It came on a few times during the 70s and 80s, but being a kid and being a teenager, I never made time to catch it. So I really did not see my first Canadian game until, I want to say, probably maybe the mid 90s, when some of the games were on ESPN.
See, that's but it's been around longer than the NFL has. Is that correct?
Yes and no. A lot of the Canadian teams, we use Toronto and Hamilton, have been around longer than any of the NFL teams, especially the Cardinals, which are my NFL team, even though I'm live here in Chicago. But the Argonauts and the Hamilton Tiger Cats have been around for longer than any of the teams in the NFL.
Good gracious. So
the Canadian Football League did not come into really being until the late 1950s in its current form. Before then, it was basically an East League and a West League. And there was the national title called the Grey Cup, but it wasn't solely a professional. Prior to the late 1950s, it really wasn't. The Grey Cup was not the Grey Cup. People competed for the Grey Cup. Teams competed for the Grey Cup that were both amateur and professional.
Wow. So they basically, it didn't matter. You're just going to play for the cup. That's your goal.
Yeah. Right.
Do you know what brought football to Canada?
Who brought football to Canada?
Yeah, because it seems like, in America, it wasn't professional. It was basically college. What brought football to America, or to Canada, I should say?
Well, in Canada, the Canadian game was started by the colleges too. It was
okay.
Both our games stem from the same heritage, which is going back to England. But at the time the American game was being developed, the Canadian game was being developed up in the colleges up there, specifically McGill University up in Montreal. And at one time there was, and this was going back, I think, into the late 1800s, there was a cross-border game played between McGill, and I want to say Harvard. I apologize. I don't have things handy in front of me in terms of history, but there was a Canadian-American college football game played at one time. And just we have a border, the rules develop differently on each side of the border.
I was watching some of the film of Canada. I love watching the two people in the backfield in motion at the same time.
The waggle, as they call it.
Right, the waggle. It's amazing that the timing gets down. By the time they hit the line of scrimmage, the ball's hiked. They don't have to stop like they do in NFL. They have to stop for a second. They have to set for a second. It looks like they're just going. Bigger field, wider field, more motion, more weapons. Do we have higher scoring in Canadian football typically?
I don't know if you have higher scoring now, but I know back in the day before, the NFL used to be primarily a run game, whereas the CFL game has always been a passing game, just because you need 3 downs to get 10 yards. But as the NFL game has opened up, you're kind of seeing, somebody mentioned on a podcast not too long ago that the NFL is becoming more CFL-like in terms of just primarily passing. And you see it in the statistics, when you compare both leagues.
Do you have, do most of the people in Canada, the Canadian teams, let me try this again. Most people in the Canadian teams, are they native-born people from Canada, or do we have a lot of transfers from America up there?
No, that's the mistake a lot of Americans make. They think that the Canadian game is played all by Canadians, where in fact Most of the players up there are American.
Now, two of my all-time favorites, Warren Moon and Doug Flutie, cut their teeth up there. Both of them played there and proved their doubters wrong in America. But what are some of the other players, right off the top of your head, that played in the NFL that started in Canada that you can think of?
Well, let me think here. And that's kind of one of the interesting things when you talk Canadian football. There's crossover, but a lot of the players that have played Canadian football are usually guys you have not heard of. They are not Hall of Famers per se, because there's only one NFL player who is in both the NFL Hall of Fame and the CFL Hall of Fame, and that is Warren Moon. So going through the list, and I would actually have to sit down with a few of my friends who are historians to talk about who started in the NFL, because my Canadian friends are really tuned into who from the CFL has gone on to great success in the NFL. Now, just thinking about CFL players that just off the top of my head, one in particular is Joe Theismann. Joe Theismann started his career up in Toronto and actually played in the Grey Cup in Toronto. He's one of the only players that there's also Joe Cap.
Yeah.
Now, again, we're going back to the 60s and 70s, but you have Joe Cap, you have Joe Theismann, and just off the top, that's all I can think of right off the top of my head.
Well, the Joe Cap, I knew about the Joe Cap play. One of the most underrated quarterbacks, but mainly because Fran Tarkenton came back in the picture after that.
Right.
But I didn't know about Joe Theismann.
Yeah, Joe Theismann, that's where he got to start. He ditched the Dolphins. He got a better offer back in the 70s and 60s. The pay scale was about the same for CFL and NFL players. So it was not uncommon for, unlike, talking about somebody else who's played in both leagues, Rocket Ishmael. Rocket Ishmael took a highly lucrative CFL contract back in the early 90s to play up in the CFL for a few years. But that's kind of a different story because at the time the league was struggling financially and Rocket Ishmael kind of came in to help put, butts in the seats more or less. But yeah, back in the 60s and 70s and the 50s, the CFL and the NFL pay scale were essentially the same. So it was not uncommon for somebody to turn down an NFL offer and go play for a little bit more money in the CFL. For instance, Cookie Gilchrist. Gilchrist was a star in the CFL, and obviously he came back down to play down in the AFL in the 60s. Now, the more we talk, the more names are coming into my head.
Well, see, that's what I'm here to jog your memory. Now, I'm looking at you wearing right now. You're wearing a Chicago Cubs hat. Are you a lifetime Cubs fan?
I have been a Cubs fan from the first time I saw a game on WGN and Jack Brickhouse calling the Cubs.
I respect that. Coming from somebody who was once a lifetime Vanderbilt fan, it hurts. It hurts to be a fan sometimes. Who's your NFL team? You said it was the Cardinals?
Yeah, the Cardinals. I am a Bears fan. Now, it's kind of weird in terms of just kind of how my pro football fandom evolved. Originally, I was a Miami Dolphins fan back in the mid-'70s, and that had everything to do with Bob Greasy and his darn glasses. Because I had it as a 10-year-old kid, I had the same glasses, and I wanted to be Bob Greasy. So that's where my football fandom started. And I was a huge Dolphins fan, and then once Greasy left and Marino came in, my allegiances switched to the Bears. That's when the Bears got really good. And somewhere in the early 90s, it was after my first trip down to Phoenix, I became a Cardinals fan and have been a Cardinals fan ever since.
Well, what do you think about their moves this offseason?
I think the Cardinals are going to be loaded. If everything, if all the stars align, they could easily go to the Super Bowl. You look at all the weapons that they have right now, but we'll see. This is the Cardinals we're talking about. We've been down this road before.
Well, I was very excited to see J.J. Watt going to another team, only to find out that we open our season against the Cardinals, the Titans do. And I'm like, doggone it. I thought we got rid of J.J. Watt.
Yeah, it's going to be. But with J.J. Watt's history of injuries, I'm not completely sold on that either. With him going to the Cardinals, because he could. I mean, he is getting older. I mean, great. They signed him to this great contract, and hopefully he's going to be there. But we all know it just takes one injury, and it can completely change a season.
Your quarterback, Kyler Murray, though, is an amazing athlete. And I think he's become more of a passer than a runner, which many, I read that people said he's not going to do that. He's going to be more of a runner. But I think his arm has gotten better over the past couple of years than people thought.
Well, yeah, and I agree with you. And it's funny, when he got drafted, I was not sold on Kyler Murray because I looked at him and I'm like, well, he's Doug Flutie-like. He's small. And I would say to my friends, I go, if he washes out with the Cardinals in the NFL, he'll go to Canada because he's the perfect size and is the perfect. If you're thinking, what does a great CFL player look like? It would be Kyler Murray. Possesses the run skills and the pass skills, and he's a dual threat. And that's what makes him so great, especially if you're a fantasy football owner. He should be your top choice going into this next season.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to actually having a draft this year, fantasy football, and I think Kyler Murray is going to go pretty high in our
We should
draft.
actually do a fantasy league for our Sports History Network, brethren.
You know what? This is a quick way to make enemies. It really is. It really is. I try to stay cordial with the people that I'm on the fantasy league with, at the same time rubbing it in when I win and hope they don't rub it in when they win,
But that's all part of it. That's the best part about football. That is what I love about football, because it doesn't matter what. First of all, the great thing about football is there are no politics involved. So
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. When it comes to football, we can all smack talk, but at the end, we are still one team, one, as we say in the military. We say in the military, one team, one fight. Same way in football. We can fight amongst each other, but at the end, we're all one league.
Well, that's what I like. And I've actually talked to people who, when I disagreed with them, they would get mad because of football. And I was like, you know what? I don't need that. But I was talking to people about Baltimore Ravens, and they smack talk me. And then we smile and shake hands and move on. It's fun. It's fun. It's supposed to be.
Yeah, and living in Chicago, it's doubly fun because not only being a big Cardinals fan, but also being a big Bears fan. So between the two teams, now both teams are from Chicago. The Cardinals originated here on the South Side over at Comiskey. For years they played at Comiskey Park. For about 9 years, they played up at Wrigley Field. But the Cardinals are a Chicago team, and I still look at them and consider them a Chicago team, even though they left Chicago before I was even born. But when it comes to smack talk, football, I love just giving Packer fans a hard time. It is the gift that keeps giving down here, and especially now with Aaron Rodgers and everything, it's always fun. But I'm smart enough to know that, the Packers, as much fun as it is to smack talk with them, it is still the history you have to respect. And that team and what it represents to a community is phenomenal. It unites a state. And you don't see that with, I don't think you see that with other NFL teams. Or the only other pro football team that comes close to that is the Saskatchewan Roughriders, because that is the only pro football team. That's the only pro team up in that province, and it's a small province. It's a much smaller population base than what Green Bay has to choose from.
Well, I was thinking about what you're saying. Yeah, it unites the group because it's older. Number one, but number two, it hasn't moved. Titans have been here for 25 years. Most people who grew up in Tennessee are, they grew up during the time of the 80s and 70s, are Cowboy fans or Steelers fans.
Right.
But if you grew up in Madison or any part of Wisconsin, you are a Packer fan.
Yeah, you're either a Packer fan or depending where you live in relation to the borders, or you're a Vikings fan or you're a Bears fan.
I'm sure that goes well over on Christmas when you come home and you see the green and the purple. That goes well.
Yeah, and it's interesting talking to people who are farther north. They say that the Vikings-Packer rivalry is a little bit more intense than the Bears-Packers rivalry.
I'm glad they could see that because I don't see that.
Yeah, well, it depends. It's just, again, when you follow it on social media at times, maybe it is. But, the Bears-Packers rivalry in terms of bragging rights is still, it's just fun. And that's the best part about all that is it's just fun. It takes our minds away from the troubles of the day.
That's part of the reason why I'm glad that the NFL played their season last year. It gave us about 3 hours a Sunday or a Monday or Tuesday, really, to not think about COVID.
Yeah. And considering, like I said, considering really, I would say the last 4 years, but just, you even go back in history, football has always been a way to bring us all together. And,
you were talking
that's
about
the best part of it.
Well, you were talking about your service in the military, and a few weeks ago, I talked to Clayton Truder about this. After 9/11, what brought the country together? Sports did.
Yeah.
Sports did. The Giants played at Kansas City. There was not a Kansas City fan in there. Everybody was a Giants fan.
Right.
I believe the World Series that year was the Mets versus the Yankees, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
New York teams. And the country can be brought together by sports if people keep in mind that this is a game that's supposed to be fun to watch.
Right. Yeah. Well, in terms of just using a Canadian analogy to it, back in the mid 90s, there were several American teams in the Canadian Football League. The Canadian Football League terms their American expansion as more of an experiment. But long story short, it basically having teams in America was a way to financially help the CFL survive to this point because they were hemorrhaging money and the CFL got expansion fees from these American teams. But in in 2 of the 3 years where there were American teams, you had an American team, the Baltimore Stallions, which I still kind of refer to them as the Baltimore Colts, which they were intended to be the Baltimore CFL Colts when Baltimore had a CFL franchise. But they played in 2 Grey Cups, 2 championship games. The first one, which they lost to the British Columbia Lions. And if you've watched, and then the Grey Cup games are available on YouTube. That's a beautiful thing about YouTube, and it's our way to look at the past that we didn't have, for instance, back when I was a kid, back in the 70s, 80s, even 90s. But you watch those games, and especially you watch that 94 Grey Cup, and you see the passion of the Canadians. That Grey Cup brought a lot of Canadians together. It united them. Even a lot of people who didn't even care about the CFL, because it was Canada versus America, brought people together. And sitting there as an American, that was good. That was very, I'm watching that. And again, it's 20 some years on, but it's fun to watch that. The patriotism. And it's a good feeling. And we have that in the States too. It's like you said, after 9/11, there was a abundance of patriotism after 9/11. Unfortunately, we don't have that right now, but hopefully it'll come back.
That's the one thing about America that I really appreciate is that we are divided on a lot of lines, but when it comes down to it, we unite.
Yeah.
Now, I ask people this, and I want to ask you this, Greg. If you had a Mount Rushmore, I don't know what they would call it in Canada. If they had a Mount Rushmore in Canada, of the top 4 players that you could think of off the top of your head in Canadian football history, what would it be?
Okay. Well, that's when you have a Mount Rushmore with 4 people and you have 9 teams. So let me think here.
Now, if you say Doug Flutie, I will put him as an asterisk. I will put him as an asterisk because to me, Doug Flutie and Warren Moon are a given. But if those are the 2 that you want to put on there, that's perfectly fine with me. But if you want to think of somebody else,
yeah, I'm searching because there's no matter who I mention, I'm going to leave somebody off.
See, that's what I want. That's what I want. I want people to just get mad and, controversy. This is what this is all about. Controversy.
Well, in terms of let's just we'll just say my personal one. If I would have a Mount Rushmore, it would be, well, you'd have Warren Moon, you would have Russ Jackson, who is the most nobody knows who Russ Jackson is down here in the States.
Yeah, I'm looking him up right now.
Yeah. And in terms of coaches, I think you would have Leo Cahill, who coached the Argonauts to several championships. And you would have Wally Buono, who was both a player and he is the all-time winningest pro football coach, north and south of the border.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. Russell Stanley Jackson, 12-year football career with the Rough Riders. By the way, the names for the Canadian teams are just awesome. All-Star in 66, 68, 69, East All-Star 62, 63, 66, 67, 68, 69. Well, doggone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's Canadian.
Well, there you go.
And unfortunately, you don't see many, if at all, Canadian quarterbacks playing in the CFL.
Good gracious. I'm looking at this guy's credentials. It's amazing. This is something that your podcast deals with a lot, correct? That you're going to talk a lot about Canadian football. Mm-hmm. And if they want to follow you on this, what is the name of your podcast again?
It is entitled From the 55-Yard Line.
From the 55-yard line. And where can they follow you on Twitter?
At CFL America.
Do you have a Facebook page yet? Or are you working on that?
No, you know what? It's funny you mentioned that. I was thinking about that the other day. And as much as I'd love to have another, I do Facebook personally, but I don't know if I want to put my CFL stuff on there. But everybody's on Twitter, I think. And I think at some point Facebook's going away. So I might have a Facebook page at some point. But no, I kind of get off Facebook I do Facebook because of the personal stuff, but it's become so politicized that I just rather go over to Twitter. On Twitter, when I'm under my CFL America handle, I ban all politics and it is just football only.
Let's see, that's what I'm talking about. And you had one drop today. You had an episode drop today. Is this going to be a weekly thing or is this going to be bi-weekly?
It's probably going to be monthly only because of my work schedule right now. And, doing a podcast, as I've learned. Now, Scott, we did our first podcast last month, but right about the time we did that, Scott ended up having to start packing up and moving back to his hometown of Birmingham. He had a change in his personal life. Him and his wife decided to move back to Birmingham, where he's from originally. And he is, and talking about Scott, he is one of the few people that I know of that has covered CFL, USFL extensively in his former job as a sports writer. He, when he was a sports writer in Birmingham, he covered the Birmingham Barracudas, which was a former expansion team down there in Alabama.
Now, if I remember correctly, he also has a book about that, doesn't he?
He does. And it's, you can, let me pull up the title here, and I apologize for not having this right. And it's funny because you mentioned this, and every time I talk about his book, I always have to look it up because it's a cool title, but it's a long title. So it is called The Home Team, My Bromance with Off-Brand Football, and it's available on Amazon. And it's
bromance. I love it.
The Bromance. And it's a really good book because when I first got it, now I didn't know Scott before I got the book. No, we were Twitter friends, which is different than being real friends. But I read it and I just couldn't put it down. And it's one of those types of book, it's written from a fan's perspective. It's not technical. It's not all stats. It's just memoirs of somebody who grew up in a town who saw many pro teams come and go from his childhood up until, the AAF with the Birmingham Iron. So it's a really good book, and it's an easy read, and it's well worth the money.
I will put a link on when this episode drops. Should be Thursday. I will put a link in the show notes for that book if I can find it myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I always have to apologize to Scott because it's like I always have to look it up because my memory, maybe it's just age catching up to me, but it's like it's a great book, but it's just got that the title is just a few words too long for me to just kind of keep in the long-term memory for whatever reason.
Well, I appreciate you coming on today, my friend, and I'm glad to meet you. And,
you're welcome. Great to meet you too.
I tell you what, when we get a little bit more knowledgeable, when I get a little bit more knowledgeable in Canadian football, I'll have you on and we'll have a question and answer where I'll ask a lot more questions because I'll be more educated then.
Cool. Now, before you let me go, just keep in mind that there is a lot of CFL players who came from the SEC.
See, now I've got more to look into.
Now, in terms of, legends, are you a Tennessee fan?
No. I grew up in Tennessee, but my first football game I went to was the Vanderbilt Commodores, and I followed them for several years until when I was growing up, Vanderbilt was my team, and most people here were Tennessee fans. I just like, you know what, I can't handle that.
Okay.
When we moved to Alabama, and two of my kids were born in Tuscaloosa, so I started following Alabama at that point. And now, when I'm talking to people and they say, "Well, Tennessee this and that," I'm like, you know what, that just makes me kind of a little nauseous inside.
Right.
But then my son comes up and says, "Daddy, I want to go to the University of Tennessee," and I was like, you know what, I can be bought. If my son gets a great scholarship to Tennessee, I can be bought. I'm not proud. I will put a big UT on the back of my car, and I will shift allegiance if I don't have to pay for college. I mean, I'll just be honest. I can be bought. Long story short, I'm not a fan right now, but I will be if my son gets a good scholarship.
Okay. Well, like I said, there's a lot, and I'll let you do your research on this, just kind of looking offline. Probably when we talk, we'll probably talk more about it. But a lot of great players have come from the SEC, including Tennessee. They're great players, but the problem is a lot of people have never heard of the Americans who have found success up in Canada, other than your Doug Fluties and your Warren Moons.
You know what? I'm looking at some of these things. Yes, there's a lot more than what I gave than I know. A whole lot more. Former prominent SEC players in the CFL. Let's look at this. You know what? I've heard of these guys. Courtney Taylor. In fact, Courtney Taylor was from a town that I was living next to. I know exactly who he is. Oh, my goodness. I'm glad you gave me this because this is a lot more in depth than I thought. And you know what? When people say, well, they had to go to Canada to play football, that doesn't mean anything. That's a professional league.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive. If you make a professional football team, I don't care if it's Canada, if it's Arena Bowl, if it's even with the AAFL, that's still pro football.
Right.
That's something.
Right.
Now, what's your favorite Canadian football team?
I would say the Argonauts because of their history as related to the NFL. And the reason being is back in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a series of exhibition games the NFL played versus CFL teams.
Wow.
And my Cardinals, both as the Chicago Cardinals and as the St. Louis Cardinals, played exhibition games against the Toronto Argonauts.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, we're in a day and age now where we can find anything online. But, you talk about these, going back 60s, the only place to find information about those games is the old newspapers. Now, fortunately for all of us, the internet has opened up a world of a window on a world of a past world that many of us didn't know unless we spent quality time in the library digging through the archives. And myself, I kind of read about in passing, but the more I started researching it online, it is a fascinating subject. And if you go to cflamerica.ca, there's a story on that on those series of exhibition games. You had the Bears playing the Montreal Alouettes. You had the Hamilton Tiger Cats and Buffalo Bills playing. You had the Argonauts and the Giants playing. So it happened. Now, the final score, except for in every game, the NFL won except for one, and that was when Hamilton beat Buffalo. But to look at those games, you have to consider they were exhibition. They were played under dual rules, meaning one quarter was played with an American set of rules, another quarter was played with 12 men. So it was more an experiment than anything. It wasn't a reflection of the talent. It was just an experiment, and they were exhibition games. So for those Americans who, for our fellow countrymen who think NFL is the top level here. Nobody is ever denying that. Even in Canada, people will say the NFL is the top level. But the CFL, man, there's a lot of great talent there. The difference is they're just paid less. And they're paid less, and they don't get as much visibility.
I imagine the pay scale is a lot different now, especially with the $100 million contracts, $200 million.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the CFL, each team only has about maybe a $4 million payroll. And you have to divide that $4 million up amongst, at least 40 players.
Good night.
Yeah. So for them, attendance is everything. And unfortunately, their season was canceled last year because of the pandemic, because they needed the gate in order to, in order for the league to work, to make money, they needed the gate, and they weren't going to get the gate. And, the CFL canceling the season is just a whole nother subject, which, it's one of those big debates in social media in terms of, canceling the season. Does it mean the death of the CFL? And now the CFL is talking with the XFL, the, version 3.0 of the XFL kind of move forward. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but the CFL, has a 100+. The Canadian football has over 100 years of history, and the CFL has in its current form, has over 60 years of history. So I'm thinking it's here to stay for the long term, but, as we kind of move on after the pandemic, it's going to, the CFL is going to look different than what it looked like before the pandemic. Hopefully not that much different. I'm hoping the 3-down game stays.
Well, I'm glad. And by the way, you did a nice segue to we're going to finish with this. If you like this podcast, you are probably a sports history fan. Go over to newspapers.com and you could probably read a lot more about Canadian football on newspapers.com, because Canada is one of the places where you got a lot of information about this. If you go to sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers, you can get a free week subscription if you subscribe to newspapers.com. And with a paid subscription, you will help this production and others on the Sports History Network. So there you go. You can learn a lot more about Canadian history.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the great thing about the internet and libraries. That's where my love of football began.
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Greg, for coming on today.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot. And I appreciate you asking me on, and we hopefully will be talking to you again soon.
Absolutely.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.